would you like to do if you had a choice about any job in the world?
The job I love to do is acting and photography.
Acting and photography?
Yes.
Oh, we'll have to do something about that, won't we?
Yes. Let me try. Let me try that.
When my daughter Eileen was born in Ireland in 1979, I went into shock. My image at that time of a person with Down syndrome fit all the stereotypes that Trinidad of the 1970s and even 80s had about what used to be called Mongolism.
Kira, high five again. Give me a high five. Yay!
In Ireland, the hospital staff could not make an absolute diagnosis because some of the telltale signs, slanted eyes for example, could have been accounted for by my Trinidadian mixed blood. Chinese, African, Portuguese, French, Italian with a dash of Carib. Only a medical test could confirm the diagnosis of Down syndrome. When Eileen was brought for baptism at our local parish church, the parish priest told us very kindly that we should put her into an institution. Instead, for the next 35 years, her father Seamus and I did everything we could to ensure that she would become the best she could be, eventually with other parents petitioning the Irish government successfully to give children with Down syndrome the right to attend mainstream primary and secondary school and to avail of tertiary education with support.
Somebody told me that you just wrote an article.
Yes.
What was the article?
The article I wrote about for people with Down syndrome. The article was for the magazine, Word magazine.
The
Word magazine.
Word magazine. What was it about?
It's all about my life. And then tell about my life story about what I did last few years.
When I returned with Eileen to live in my birthplace, we discovered that Trinidad and Tobago was not unlike Ireland back then in the treatment of the disabled. Yes, parents no longer abandoned their children with Down syndrome at the gates of the Lady Ho Choi home. But it is still likely that a person with a disability will be stared at or excluded or made to feel both inept and inhuman.
I came in the 70s, right? And from then to now, there are a lot of changes, especially when it comes to parents. I remember the days when we used to have someone waiting outside or keeping the gate so that parents don't leave their children and disappear.
You mean abandoned?
Yes, yes. Today, parents ask for help rather than looking to give over their children to you. Joshua is one of those cases. His granny just came asking that we assist because none of the daycare centers would take him. Number one, he takes too long to feed. So we just assist her in keeping the child during the day.
There are still persons resident in St. Anne's who are there simply because no one knows what to do with an institutionalized person who has autism or Down syndrome or a myriad of disabilities, in particular intellectual disabilities. In fact, many individuals in Trinidad and Tobago do not even know what the term intellectual disability means. Persons with all types of disabilities face discrimination at several levels, whether they have Down syndrome, autism, or whether their disability is purely physical, as with those who are blind or visually impaired, who are deaf, or who lack mobility, including people in wheelchairs, and persons with cerebral palsy. Despite many individual efforts, Trinidad and Tobago still lags far behind in its attitudes and treatment of persons with disabilities, in particular in the areas of employment and services.
I think about Isaiah and I know he will never maybe be able to take a maxi. He will never be able to walk out the road and say, "You're going in town?" You know, that is how I feel. I mean, he's going to be 11 this year. So, and I am 59. Okay? So I have to be realistic about how I approach life. And that is one of the things that really I decided that I wasn't going to be making fiction films and no more hinking estates and those things for me right now. I'm going to bring all those skill sets into creating awareness campaigns and making film and other content with a view to transforming perspectives. I can quite easily tell you this is what I will be doing for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Right? And in trying to build these communities. So that this is my mission, this is my life work, this is what I'm doing right now.
In 2002, an historic event occurred. George Daniel, a young man in a wheelchair, orchestrated a protest at the Trinidad flour mills because of the failure of this establishment to hire persons with disabilities.
He told me that the human resource manager had him waiting here at one time from 10 o'clock in the morning until 6 in the afternoon, and she passed in the back and leave him outside here waiting, and that is totally unacceptable.
This event created front page news. Yet, we still have no Disability Act, and the Equal Opportunities Act in its current form actively discriminates against persons with disabilities.
There needs to be a Trinidad and Tobago Disability Act that spells out exactly what persons with disabilities are entitled to in this society, because for too long the disabled have been underserved, underemployed and disadvantaged in this society.
Lack of job opportunities is one aspect of the failure to actually see persons with disabilities as full and equal citizens. In part, this is due to segregation, sometimes from birth, and often within the education system. As a result of inadequate systems for providing services that are specific to their condition, many people who are intellectually slow or who require particular supports are relegated to unequal lives. I understand that in situations, for example, during the state of emergency, that persons who are deaf suffered quite particular setbacks or breaches of their rights.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I remember the first day. We actually had a final of a deaf football match. I can't remember what the time was, but it was evening. It was about, say, 9 o'clock that the match finished. And then people were kind of talking afterwards. And lots of people were just liming and, you know, whatever, just normal. And we didn't know about the state of emergency. We hadn't heard anything about it. And some deaf people went to a party late. They didn't know anything about it afterwards, so the game had just finished. And they got taken in by police. And in the end, they were fined as a result of it. But they had not been informed at any point about what was going on.
If you are deaf, this may mean never becoming sufficiently competent in the English language, because the educational institutions do not take account of these special needs.
The reason is that their first language is not English, of course. Their first language is a signed language. Trinidad and Tobago actually has its own sign language, unique sign language. And most deaf people grow up with that as their first language. And, of course, the education system at school doesn't really take account of that kind of difference. So when you're a deaf child going to school, lots of deaf children now are mainstreamed. And so most of the classes that they take are conducted with English as the language of instruction. And so that barrier, that language barrier, really holds people back in many ways.
Dr. Benjamin Braithwaite teaches sign language at the University of the West Indies and also runs a class at the Lloyd Best Institute in English language acquisition for the deaf. For the blind, the option may be committal to workplaces, within which highly competent and talented individuals do mindless tasks.
So when I came down to Trinidad and realized that at the time of my father's death, opportunities for the blind and visually impaired in Trinidad were desperately lacking, I realized that I had to do something about it. My father was born in Tableland, Trinidad, in the deep south. And when he came to Port of Spain in 1950, he was looking for employment. And the only employment that he found was to weave baskets and cane chairs at the Trinidad and Tobago Blind Welfare Association on Duke Street, Port of Spain.
Menu 5 items check. Touch. Latch. Right.
A person such as Jason demonstrates how family intervention and a sense of self-worth enables the fulfillment of potential.
I'm from a large family, and I have 2 brothers and 3 sisters. So they, along with my mom, decided very early that Jason is not going to live as a blind person. So I was never encouraged to think of myself as different. I did everything. I swam, I windsurfed, I went to normal school, maybe not necessarily in that order, but, I explored everything that I wanted to do. And there was this thing in our home: if it's dangerous and is recommended not for a visually impaired person to do it, Jay will do it. There were a lot of systems that we had to put in place because the technology wasn't like now. Before I went to Holy Name Prep, I went to the school for blind for a few years. And I guess it was at that point I lived in 2 worlds. When I'm home, I'm living among the sighted. But when I went to the school for blind, basically I fell into the groove of the culture. And I live and did the things that the blind people did, which I realized were very different. And unfortunately, so many years later, it is still different, and it's not necessarily good that it's different. I don't think it needs to be different, but I think the culture has been so ingrained for so many years that a lot of people can't seem to snap out of it.
Jason's situation suggests that if an individual is treated as a normal citizen, he develops in a normal way.
The way it works is the way you show yourself to the world is how they would perceive you and how they would treat you.
Part of the problem is visibility. When I first returned to Trinidad, I wondered whether there were any individuals with Down syndrome. Families hid away their children and adults. This has changed dramatically, in part due to media coverage and activism by groups such as the Autistic Society and the Down Syndrome Family Network. But persons with autism and other forms of disability are still struggling to become fully visible and to access services.
I understand that you are a teacher.
Yes. Right. I decided to go into the profession because of Kyle, in order to assist him. One of the issues I found when I was looking for a school to place him is that there were not many schools, if any at all, that would cater to his autism disorder. So therefore, I decided, okay, I need to do something about that.
Well, my experience was one where I was compelled to see a social worker, and basically her job was to counsel me to ensure that, I can handle this particular situation. But outside of that, that was it.
Don't mess around. Don't put the paddle up here.
Okay, play.
And
he went to Pontypridd Government Special School. This was a specialized school. He did not go into the typical primary school because I was aware of, the size of the classrooms. The primary school classes are too large. There are like 30 students in a classroom. And the teachers were not really trained to handle someone with autism. So I didn't want to take the risk of putting him into that school system where, he may get lost because teachers are unaware what to do with him.
Well, I was fortunate in that I enrolled her at a school in which early intervention was practiced, and that's where I first heard about it. For me, they basically explained where some of her learning challenges were going to be, and they actually guided me along that pathway. So they said, okay, she'll have difficulties in speech. They said that she'll have difficulties in conceptualizing mathematics, and the specific exercises they gave helped in that regard.
We need this support system, right? You can put a child with disability in a classroom and say, oh, we have inclusion, but that's not inclusion. You have to provide the support, the resources for the student as well as the family, because the family has to be a part. You have to partner with the family in order for the child to have success.
As far as supports, I am not aware of any. My entire experience with her upbringing was one where I physically had to be there. I was the one who did the research. I was the one who presented the information to the teachers as to what to do. And what I've done when it's absent in a particular school, I simply find where she can receive that particular support, and I take her to that place. So that has been my experience. But to say that it is all in one place and it's easy to find, no, I can't say that.
It is not that there are no systems, but educational facilities and specialized training are very limited.
Go ahead.
There's a problem of access to services, and the fact that support services are hindered by red tape and a lack of knowledge and of training in many areas. It is even difficult to access information where services are available. For persons who can access the means to do so, there is always the possibility of private therapies or going abroad. Zuri, for example, lost her hearing at the age of 3 due to bacterial meningitis and now wears cochlear implants.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. You say bye-bye. 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 Yes.
This is back tree. It's also the big one, which lasts for 24 hours. Then there's small one, about this size, that lasts for 12 hours. So this is the hook. I'm not sure what this middle part is.
That's the processor.
Yes, processor. And this black thing here is a headpiece.
We didn't have enough because I can't even remember the cost of the implants and the surgery. I think it was something like around $90,000 US. And we set up Facebook appeals. We told people Zuri needs 2,500 angels donating 300 TT or 50 US each to help her hear again. And it was amazing. That to me was viral marketing right there. That was the best use ever of my marketing degree. And the thing is too, with the surgery, it's not particularly invasive. So surgery was done in 3 hours. She stayed at the hospital overnight, and by the following day, they were ready to take out stitches.
Do members of the deaf community support the use of cochlear implants?
So I think that cochlear implants are, that's what hearing people and hearing families think is a good idea. But for deaf families, and for deaf people, they don't want to be forced into something, and if you grow up as a deaf person, you want to have the choice whether you have a cochlear implant or not. Education needs to be includes sign language as well as learning to speak and learning to lip read. And cochlear implants are sometimes treated as a solution where you don't need sign language anymore. It's very important that education doesn't just give force deaf children down that one way.
Much depends on the determination and resilience of parents and families in the early years of a child's life. Andrew's story points to those mothers and families in Trinidad and Tobago who have refused to succumb to the stigma of disability. Disability did not prevent Andrew from attending Fatima College and from going abroad to further his studies.
I would like a life like everybody else. I would love to have not a job. I don't want a job. I want a career. I want to have a career that I enjoy, that I make a salary and not a handout.
Therapists can only do so much, and they only have a very short period of time with any child, like as any able-bodied kid. So what it entails is a lot of input from family, from parents, from the caregivers. When there's no carryover, there'll be no progress. And quite often, it's simply because the parents are not in a position to dedicate the time available.
That's true.
Or not being made aware of.
I think that too.
So you're going to try to go into Portishead for carnival?
I'm not going to carnival, it's not my favourite.
If a child has an intellectual or developmental disorder, then it becomes obvious that there is a twofold issue. These are changing how society sees a person with a disability and ensuring that the individual can become part of a community from an early age. That demands integration. Parents have sought to educate themselves, to educate their children, because the state has not provided support systems for inclusion. The problem becomes one of changing the system to make the system adapt to the needs of the child. There have been fragmented efforts to make the people of this nation see persons with disabilities as full human beings. Yet the problems remain. There are problems of access, of inadequate services and structures, and too few special education teachers. This is happening even amidst the courage of those with disabilities who have become successful in our society and who have proven that persons with disabilities may become productive citizens of Trinidad and Tobago.